The air in the Veterans Affairs Hospital tasted of stale coffee, industrial bleach, and the quiet despair of old wounds that never fully healed. It was a flavor Alara Vance had grown accustomed to over 6 years, a chemical tang that clung to her scrubs and lived in the back of her throat long after her shift ended. The fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous, buzzing dirge overhead, casting a sterile, unforgiving glare on the polished linoleum floors. Each squeak of her rubber-soled shoes was a lonely percussion in the symphony of late-night hospital sounds. The distant, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor, the gentle whoosh of a ventilator, the hushed, weary voices of the night staff. It was a world away from the grit and chaos she had once known, a self-imposed exile in a purgatory of routine and paperwork. Alara moved through the ward with an economy of motion that bordered on spectral. She was a woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible, to make her presence known only when necessary. Her colleagues saw her as dependable, quiet, perhaps a little old-fashioned. They saw the faint lines of fatigue etched around her eyes and assumed they were from the grueling 12-hour shifts. They saw the disciplined set of her jaw and mistook it for sternness. They saw a competent, unassuming nurse, a woman in her late 30s who had seemingly appeared out of nowhere 6 years ago, with impeccable credentials and no traceable past. None of them saw the predator that slumbered just beneath the surface, the apex operator, coiled and waiting behind the placid mask of professionalism. They didn't see the way her eyes never stopped scanning, cataloging exits, assessing potential threats, analyzing the subtle tells in a patient's posture or the tremor in a family member's hand. These were instincts carved into her nervous system by a life she had tried to bury under layers of sterile gauze and procedural checklists. She was in the middle of her final rounds, checking the saline drip for a sleeping Vietnam veteran in room 3B, when Dr. Alistair Finch swept onto the floor. He moved not like a healer, but like a feudal lord surveying his domain. His white coat was pristine. His expensive leather shoes clicked with an arrogant cadence on the tile, and his voice, when he spoke, was a finely tuned instrument of condescension. He was a man who had mistaken his medical degree for a crown, and treated the nursing staff as his serfs. "Nurse Vance," he said, his tone clipped, not even bothering to look at her as he glanced at the chart in his hand. "Mr. Henderson's pressure is still trending low. Did you increase the norepinephrine as I ordered?" "I did, Dr. Finch," Alara replied, her voice level, betraying none of the irritation she felt. 30 minutes ago. His map is holding steady at 65. Finch made a non-committal grunt, the sound of a man for whom good news was an inconvenience, as it deprived him of an opportunity to assert his superiority. He turned his attention to Maya, a young nurse barely a year out of school, who was diligently organizing a medication cart nearby. Maya, bless her heart, still believed in the inherent goodness of the system and saw doctors as partners in care. She looked up at Finch with wide, hopeful eyes, a lamb before the slaughter. "Nurse Chin, is it?" Finch asked, deliberately getting her name wrong for the 3rd time that week. "It's Ramirez, doctor," Maya said softly, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Right, Ramirez. See that you double-check Vance's charting. Her penmanship is atrocious. We're running a hospital here, not a grade school art class." He offered a thin, mirthless smile, then turned and strode away toward the doctor's lounge, likely to complain about his golf handicap to anyone unfortunate enough to be trapped in there with him. Alara watched him go, a familiar, cold knot tightening in her stomach. It was the friction of it all that wore her down more than the long hours. The petty tyrannies, the bureaucratic inertia, the egos that swelled to fill rooms and left no space for the quiet, vital work of healing. Men like Finch were the reason she had left the other world behind. They were the commanders who drew lines on maps without ever having walked the terrain. The politicians who sent young soldiers to die for objectives they couldn't pronounce. They were the architects of flawed systems, insulated from the consequences of their own incompetence. Here, in this quiet hospital wing, Finch was a minor annoyance. Out there, in the world she had fled, he was the kind of man who got people killed. Maya wheeled the cart over, her brow furrowed with a mixture of frustration and hurt. He's just having a bad night, I guess. He's had a bad night every night for the 6 years I've worked here, Alara said, her voice a low murmur. She placed a comforting hand on Maya's shoulder. Don't let him get to you. Focus on the work. The work is what matters. The work was her sanctuary. In the methodical rhythm of checking vitals, administering medication, and cleaning wounds, she found a semblance of the order she craved. It was a simple, honest transaction. A person was broken, and she applied her skills to help put them back together. There was no ambiguity, no political maneuvering, no acceptable losses. There was only the patient, the problem, and the solution. It was a clean, honorable equation that had drawn her to this life, a stark contrast to the bloody, complex calculus of her past. She had traded her rifle for a syringe, her tactical gear for scrubs, the arid sands of forgotten war zones for the sterile corridors of a VA hospital. She had convinced herself it was enough. The relative quiet of the night was shattered not by a siren, but by the squeal of tires and the harsh, guttural shouts of men accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed instantly. It was a sound that didn't belong in the sanitized confines of the hospital. Alara's head snapped up, her body instantly alert, her posture shifting from weary nurse to coiled spring. The calm facade dissolved, replaced by the honed instincts of a hunter. Her gaze swept the entrance to the emergency bay, her mind already running tactical assessments. 2 men, military, high-stress situation. One was the source of the shouting. A side door to the ER burst open, and a man in tactical pants and a tight, dark t-shirt barreled through. He was built like a siege engine, a solid wall of muscle and barely controlled kinetic energy. An insignia on his shirt marked him as a Navy SEAL. His face was a mask of frantic desperation, his eyes wild. He wasn't the patient. In his arms, he carried a large, limp form wrapped in a blood-soaked blanket. It was a dog. A Belgian Malinois, its fawn and black fur matted with dark, slick fluid. "I need a doctor! Now!" the SEAL roared, his voice echoing in the cavernous ER reception area. "I have an officer down! I need a trauma surgeon!" Dr. Finch emerged from the lounge, a look of profound annoyance on his face at being disturbed. "What is the meaning of this? This is a hospital, not a veterinary clinic." "This is Fenrir," the SEAL shot back, his voice cracking with emotion. "He's a master-at-arms, United States Navy. He's got more confirmed saves than any man in this building. He took a bad fall in a live-fire training exercise. Something collapsed. I think his chest is crushed." Alara was already moving, her stride long and purposeful. Maya trailed in her wake, her eyes wide with alarm. Alara ignored Finch and the SEAL's verbal sparring. Her focus was absolute, narrowed to the injured animal. She could smell the blood now, the coppery, metallic tang that was as familiar to her as the scent of rain. She saw the shallow, rapid breaths, the pale gums, the thready pulse she could almost feel from across the room. This was not a simple injury. This was catastrophic trauma. Finch, his authority challenged, stepped forward with a pompous air. "Calm yourself, Lieutenant. We will take a look, but you must understand, our resources are for human patients." He gestured dismissively to an examination room. "Put the animal on the table." The SEAL, whose name tag read Thorn, gently laid the dog down. Fenrir let out a low, pained whimper, his powerful body trembling uncontrollably. Thorn stroked his head, murmuring reassurances that sounded more like prayers. "Hang in there, boy. Just hang in there." Finch approached the table with the reluctance of a man forced to handle something unclean. He prodded the dog's side with a gloved finger, causing a fresh wave of tremors. "Looks like a few broken ribs, maybe a minor pneumothorax. We'll give him some painkillers and you can take him to a proper vet in the morning. There's really not much more we can do here." Alara froze. She saw it instantly. The distended jugular vein, the paradoxical movement of the chest wall, the subtle cyanotic tinge to the dog's tongue. It wasn't a minor pneumothorax. It was a tension pneumothorax, and a severe one. Air was filling the chest cavity with every panicked breath, compressing the lungs and the heart, turning the dog's own body into a pressure vessel that was suffocating him from the inside out. And there was something else, a strange rigidity in the animal's limbs, a subtle but distinct chemical smell rising from the wound that Finch, with his civilian-trained nose, had completely missed. It was a residue she recognized from a very specific type of breaching charge, one known to have neurotoxic side effects in close proximity. The clock was ticking down. They didn't have until morning. They had minutes, maybe less. Finch's diagnosis was not just wrong, it was a death sentence. His arrogance and his species-centric bias had blinded him to the critical, life-threatening reality unfolding on his examination table. He saw a dog with a broken rib. Alara saw a fellow soldier dying on the battlefield. The system, in the form of Dr. Alistair Finch, was failing. The protocol was failing. And Alara Vance, the quiet, unassuming nurse, felt the ghost of the operator she once was rise up within her, cold and decisive. The time for quiet competence was over. She stepped forward, her movement precise and devoid of hesitation. Her voice was calm, but it carried a new and unfamiliar weight, a low-frequency authority that cut through the rising panic in the room. "Dr. Finch, you're wrong." Finch turned, his face a thundercloud of indignation. "Excuse me, Nurse Vance? Did you say something?" "His trachea is deviating to the right," Alara stated, not as a suggestion, but as a battlefield assessment. Her eyes were locked on the dying dog. "He's in obstructive shock from a tension pneumothorax. If we don't decompress his chest cavity in the next 90 seconds, he'll go into cardiac arrest." Finch let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A tension pneumothorax? Don't be absurd. You've been watching too much television. It's a simple fracture. Now step aside and let me do my job." "You're not doing your job," Alara said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet each word landed with the impact of a hammer blow. "You're letting him die." Thorne looked from the doctor to the nurse, his face a canvas of confusion and fear. He was a man used to clear chains of command, to decisive action. Now he was caught between a dismissive doctor and an intensely focused nurse who was directly contradicting him. The dog on the table let out a choked gasp, its breathing becoming terrifyingly shallow. Alara didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for Finch to process the insult. The time for debate was over. The patient was crashing. She turned to Maya, who was standing frozen by the supply cabinet. The command voice, the one she hadn't used in 6 years, emerged from the depths, sharp and clear and utterly undeniable. "Maya, get me a 14-gauge angiocath, a large one, betadine swabs, and a sterile glove with the thumb cut off. Now!" Maya, startled by the sheer force of Alara's tone, didn't question it. She simply moved, her training overriding her fear. She spun around and began pulling the requested items with trembling hands. Finch's face purpled with rage. "Vance, so help me God, if you touch that animal, I will have your license. That is a direct order." Alara met his gaze. For a fleeting second, the quiet nurse vanished completely, and Dr. Finch found himself looking into the eyes of something ancient and dangerous. There was no fear there, no insubordination. There was only a cold, chilling certainty, the look of a person for whom life and death decisions were as natural as breathing. "Your order is irrelevant," she said softly. "It's the wrong call." She turned her back on him, a gesture of dismissal so profound it left him momentarily speechless. She took the supplies from Maya, her hands moving with a fluid, terrifying grace. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. It was the brutal economy of a skill honed not in a classroom, but in the blood and dust of places that didn't appear on any map. She palpated the dog's chest, her fingers expertly finding the second intercostal space, the sweet spot just above the third rib. She swabbed the area with betadine in a single, efficient circle. "Hold him steady," she commanded Thorne, who instinctively obeyed, placing his large hands on the dog's shoulders. With the smooth, practiced motion of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, she plunged the large-bore needle into Fenrir's chest. It was a violent, decisive act, a calculated breach of the body's sovereignty in order to save it. There was a soft pop as the needle entered the pleural space, followed by a distinct and immediate hiss. It was the sound of trapped air, of fatal pressure escaping its prison, the sound of life being given a second chance. Fenrir's body, which had been rigid with strain, went slack. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the first full breath he had taken since the injury. The frantic hammering of his heart, visible under his ribs, began to slow to a more regular, powerful rhythm. The color was already returning to his gums. He was stabilized. Just like that, in the space of 10 seconds, Alara had single-handedly pulled him back from the precipice of death. The room fell into a stunned, ringing silence. Maya stared, her mouth agape, the empty supply packet still clutched in her hand. Dr. Finch stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent fury. Lieutenant Commander Thorne looked down at his dog, then up at Alara, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The just a nurse he had been about to dismiss had just performed a life-saving, invasive procedure with the calm precision of a master surgeon. Thorne, his adrenaline still coursing, finally found his voice. It came out as a ragged bark, a desperate attempt to reclaim control of a situation that had spun completely beyond him. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he snarled, turning his fear and fury on Alara. "You could have killed him. You're just a nurse." It was the wrong thing to say, and the reaction came from the one being in the room whose instincts were purer than any of the humans. Fenrir, the highly trained war dog, the hardened combat asset, lifted his head weakly. His intelligent brown eyes, no longer hazed with pain, looked past his handler. He saw Alara, standing calm and still, the scent of blood and antiseptic clinging to her, her posture radiating a quiet, unshakable authority. He let out a low, soft whimper. It was not a sound of pain, but of submission, of recognition. With a great effort, the 100-pound animal pushed himself up on his forelegs, dragged his body off the examination table, and collapsed at Alara's feet. He pressed his head firmly against her leg, hiding behind her, seeking protection and comfort from the woman who had saved him. The sight struck Thorne dumb. His own dog, his partner, his other half, an animal trained to face gunfire and explosions without flinching, was now whimpering and hiding behind a nurse, seeking refuge from its own handler. The dog knew. On a primal, instinctive level that transcended training and species, Fenrir recognized the true source of strength and safety in the room. And it wasn't the arrogant doctor. It wasn't even the seal he had served with for years. It was the quiet woman in the pale blue scrubs. Thorne stared at the scene, the sneer dying on his lips, replaced by a profound and unsettling awe. He looked at Alara, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw the cold, controlled focus in her eyes. He saw the way she held herself, a perfect center of gravity, ready to move in any direction. He saw the faint, silvery trace of a scar peeking out from the cuff of her sleeve, a pattern he vaguely recognized. He wasn't looking at a nurse. He was looking at a warrior. A ghost. The spell was broken by Finch, who finally found his voice, a shriek of pure, impotent rage. "Security! I want security in here now! This woman is insane! She's assaulted a patient! I'm pressing charges! You're fired, Vance! Your career is over! I will personally see to it that you never work in a hospital again!" He took a step toward Alara, his hand reaching out as if to grab her arm. It was a foolish, reflexive action, born of a lifetime of unchecked privilege. Alara didn't even seem to move. Her left hand came up in a blur, not to strike, but to intercept. Her fingers wrapped around his wrist, her thumb finding the radial nerve with surgical precision. It was not a slap or a punch. It was something far more terrifying. It was a tactical restraint, applied with minimal effort and maximum effect. A wave of searing, electric pain shot up Finch's arm, and he let out a strangled cry, his knees buckling. "Do not," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it was colder and harder than the steel of a scalpel. "Touch me, doctor." She released him as quickly as she had grabbed him. Finch stumbled back, clutching his wrist, his face pale with shock and pain. He stared at her, no longer with anger, but with a dawning, primal fear. The power dynamic in the room had been irrevocably shattered. He had been the predator, the authority. Now, he was nothing more than prey, utterly and completely outmatched. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds, a silent, brutal ballet of violence that Thorne recognized with a jolt of ice in his veins. That was not a self-defense move taught in any civilian class. That was an operator's takedown. It was the kind of thing you saw in a kill house at Dam Neck, not in the emergency room of a VA hospital. Just then, 2 hospital security guards, a weary man in his 60s and a younger, overweight partner, arrived, drawn by Finch's shouts. They were followed by a flustered-looking hospital administrator in a rumpled suit, Mr. Harris, and, to Thorne's immense surprise, his own commanding officer, Admiral Croft. The Admiral must have been in a meeting nearby and had been called as soon as Thorne had radioed in about Fenrir, a testament to the dog's importance. "What in the world is going on in here?" Harris demanded, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. Finch nursing his wrist, Thorne standing stock still in shock, Maya looking terrified, and Alara standing calmly with a massive war dog pressed against her legs. Finch, seeing his authority figures arrive, found a fresh surge of blustering indignation. "That woman!" he screeched, pointing a trembling finger at Alara. "She assaulted me! After she performed a rogue, unsanctioned procedure on this dog. She's a menace! I want her arrested!" Admiral Croft, a tall, imposing man with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, ignored Finch completely. His gaze was fixed on Alara. He took a slow step forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her face, then down at the faint scar on her wrist, now fully visible. He was silent for a long moment, the air thick with tension. "Vance," the Admiral said, his voice a low rumble. "Alara Vance. I'll be damned." He looked at the dog at her feet, then back at her. "The procedure. Needle thoracostomy?" "Yes, Admiral," Alara replied, her voice steady. "Tension pneumothorax, complicated by suspected neurotoxin exposure from a C4 variant breaching charge." The Admiral's eyebrows shot up. That level of diagnostic specificity was unheard of outside of a very small, very specialized community. He took another step closer, his eyes scanning her with an intensity that made everyone else in the room feel like background scenery. He stopped, his gaze locked on a small, faded tattoo just below her hairline, mostly hidden by her hair. It was a stylized bird of prey, wings folded, almost invisible unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. "My God," the Admiral breathed, his voice filled with a reverence that stunned everyone present. He turned to Thorne, whose jaw was now hanging open. "Lieutenant Commander, do you know who you were speaking to?" Thorne just shook his head, speechless. The Admiral turned his gaze back to Alara. "You're not Nurse Vance. You're Kestrel, aren't you? Task Force 11, the ghost of Kandahar." The name hung in the air, meaningless to Harris and Finch and Maya, but it hit Thorne like a physical blow. Kestrel. It wasn't a name, it was a legend, a myth, whispered in hushed, reverent tones in forward operating bases and classified debriefings. Kestrel was a Tier 1 Special Operations combat medic, attached to a ghost unit that technically didn't exist. They were the scalpel used for the blackest of black ops. Kestrel, specifically, was said to be a miracle worker, a phantom who could walk through a firefight and piece soldiers back together with nothing but a medical kit and sheer force of will. Dozens of operators, men considered the deadliest warriors on the planet, owed their lives to a ghost they had never seen, a quiet voice in the dark, a pair of steady hands in the midst of chaos. Kestrel had reportedly been killed in action on a mission in the Hindu Kush 5 years ago. "Dr. Finch," Admiral Croft said, his voice now dropping to a dangerously quiet level, the parade ground boom replaced by the hiss of a slow-burning fuse. "This nurse, as you call her, holds the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 silver stars, and 5 bronze stars with valor. She has more logged hours in active combat trauma surgery than your entire surgical department combined. She has performed this exact procedure under machine gun fire in a pitch-black cave while wounded. You did not just question her medical judgment. You, a civilian, attempted to countermand a field order from one of the most decorated operators in the history of the Special Warfare Command. Finch's face had gone from purple to a pasty, sickly white. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a slack-jawed mask of pure terror. He looked at Alara, at the quiet woman he had belittled and harassed for years, and finally saw her for what she was, a living legend who had chosen to hide in plain sight. He had not just made a mistake, he had committed an act of sacrilege. The hospital administrator, Harris, was now sweating profusely, his mind racing through the potential lawsuits and the sheer scale of the public relations nightmare that was unfolding. He turned on Finch, his voice a venomous whisper. "Alistair, you are suspended, effective immediately. We will conduct a full investigation. Get out of my hospital. Now." Finch didn't need to be told twice. He practically scrambled out of the room, a broken, humiliated man, his career in tatters. The arrogant bureaucrat had finally been crushed under the weight of his own hubris. Admiral Croft turned his full attention back to Alara. The hardness in his eyes softened into something that looked almost like relief. "We thought you were dead, Kestrel. Your file is sealed at the highest level. We've been looking for you for years. After what happened on that last mission, we understood why you disappeared, but we never stopped looking." Alara finally looked away from the dog, meeting the Admiral's gaze. The exhaustion in her eyes was profound, a weariness that went far beyond a single 12-hour shift. "I just wanted some quiet, sir," she said, her voice soft. "I was tired of the noise." "I can imagine," the Admiral said gently. He gestured toward Fenrir, who was now resting peacefully, his head on Alara's shoe. "The world has a way of finding people like you. It seems the work isn't done with you yet." He paused, his expression turning serious. "I'm not here to drag you back into that life, but a new opportunity has come up. Something you might find suitable. We're launching a new state-of-the-art trauma and rehabilitation center for our canine units. The best technology, the best funding. But we need a director. Someone who understands both the medicine and the mission. Someone who understands that they're not just dogs, they're soldiers." He looked pointedly at Fenrir, then back at Alara. "It's a quiet place. No bureaucrats, no committees, just the work. Your work." It was not an order, it was an offer. A path back, but on her own terms. A chance to use her unique, hard-won skills in a place where they would be valued, where she could heal the silent four-legged warriors who asked for nothing and gave everything. A place where she could finally find a different kind of peace. Later that night, long after the Admiral and the Administrator had left, after the official reports had been filed and the murmurs had spread through the hospital staff like wildfire, Alara sat on the floor of a quiet recovery room. Fenrir lay on a soft bed beside her, an IV line dripping steadily into his leg. He was stable, sleeping deeply, the rhythmic rise and fall of his powerful chest, a comforting, steady presence in the quiet room. The door opened softly, and Lieutenant Commander Thorne stepped inside. He had changed out of his tactical gear and into a simple t-shirt and jeans. The arrogant, frantic seal from the ER was gone, replaced by a humbled, quiet man. He stood awkwardly by the door for a moment, as if unsure of his right to be there. "The Admiral told me," Thorne said, his voice low. He walked over and sat on the floor a few feet from Alara, careful not to disturb the dog. He was silent for a long time, just watching Fenrir breathe. "They don't give out the DSC easily." Alara said nothing, her hand resting gently on the dog's warm fur. "Helmand Province, 2012, Thorne said, his voice thick with memory. "My team got hit by a command-detonated IED. We were pinned down, 3 of us bleeding out. Medevac was a no-go. We were preparing to die." He looked at his hands. "Then, she came, out of the smoke. We never saw her face. She was covered in gear. Didn't say a word, just moved from man to man, a ghost in the chaos. Plugging holes, starting lines, cracking chests. She stayed with us for 2 hours, keeping us alive with nothing but skill and sheer will until a window opened for extraction. They called her Kestrel. We called her the Angel of the Helmand. He looked up, and his eyes met Alara's. There was no doubt in them, only a profound, soul-deep gratitude. We never got to say thank you. You just did, Alara said softly. Just save your dog. That's enough. Thorn nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He understood. It wasn't about the medals, the recognition, or the legends. For her, it had only ever been about the work. About the quiet, desperate calculus of saving one more life. He reached out, not to her, but to his dog, and gently stroked Fenrir's head. The dog stirred, letting out a soft sigh of contentment, safe and sound between his two protectors. Alara watched them, a rare, small smile touching her lips. For years, she had believed that her two lives were incompatible, that the quiet nurse could never coexist with the combat operator. But here, in the stillness of this room, with a sleeping warrior at her feet and a grateful soldier by her side, she realized they were not two different people. They were two sides of the same coin, forged in the same fire. She was not just a nurse, and she was no longer just an operator. She was a protector. And as she listened to the steady, life-affirming rhythm of the dog's breathing, she knew she had finally found a battlefield where she could win the war for peace. True strength was never in the rank you held or the uniform you wore. It was in the silent, unwavering courage to answer the call, no matter the form it took.